Well, thanks for watching. We'll be seeing ya. Clearly, it's possible to start something too close to the end, but I regularly think about a teacher I had who gave me the advice to start telling my stories as close to the end as possible. He must have observed what I've observed in the work of many beginning writers, that they start too far from the ending, and as a result, their readers have to put up with a lot of extra length before the reading gets interesting. When that happens, you run the risk of your readers getting bored, giving up, and going to do something more fun, maybe like making grapefruit ice cream. And of course, when you've poured your whole heart into your magnum opus, the last thing you want is for your readers to quit on it prematurely. So today, I wanted to pass along this timeless advice and show you how it works in any kind of writing. In my years of writing and teaching, I've seen many essays that start with the earliest days of civilization, endured many short stories that are 80% explanation and 20% plot, and wandered through poems that didn't really know what they were about until the last line. Now, these are all different kinds of writing, but the main issue arises from the same root cause. They all start too far from the ending. And when I say that, I don't just mean that they were too long. Starting closer to the ending does not just mean cutting things short. Instead, it means understanding the purpose of what you're writing, and then aligning your piece with that purpose from the very beginning. You might think of it like this. When somebody invites you over for dinner, they don't usually ask you to come in the middle of the afternoon to watch them cook. Instead, they invite you to come in the evening to eat the food when it's ready. Of course, the food does need to be prepared, but that's something that the host does on their own. It's not something that the guests need to sit through. And in a similar sense, your readers don't need to sit through volumes of world building and history, or a literature review that goes back to Pythagoras. Those might be things that you need to write in order to figure out your purpose, but your readers just don't need them. World building is not storytelling any more than cooking is eating. They might be necessary preliminary steps, but they aren't the actual intended purpose. So another way of saying start as close to the ending as you can might be start with a clear purpose and stick with it to the end. Every piece has a job to do, and that job is something that it often shares with other similar kinds of writing. This might not be groundbreaking stuff, but the job of a story is to tell a story. The job of a research paper is to answer a question and present the findings, and the job of a work email is to convey information in a collegial way. Of course, any specific research paper will answer a unique question, but all research papers will answer questions. And when you realize that, it gets easier to think in terms of your actual purpose. There's a reason most writing teachers will tell you to put your thesis statement in the first paragraph of a paper. It's because it articulates the purpose of that paper and is therefore the spark that gets the whole thing going. And every kind of writing has that spark that gets it going. If we use the language of rhetorical theory, we could call it an exigence, or the reason for writing in the first place. And the purpose of any piece is to address its exigence. So a novel gets going because of some kind of tension or conflict. Something happens that causes the main character to do something in order to resolve the tension or settle the conflict. A persuasive argument gets going because a problem or crisis arises, and the paper then unfolds by developing and defending a solution to that problem. And a poem gets going because the poet observes something that pulls them out of the stupor of routine, and that observation develops into some kind of insight. So we could think of any kind of writing as operating on the basis of an exigence and a resolution. The resolution is the ending, and the exigence is where you should begin. For example, I regularly read academic papers that go on for pages and pages just providing information without ever really articulating a thesis or a problem and solution pair. And similarly, I also encounter a lot of short stories that spend a lot of time describing the characters and the world they live in without ever introducing any kind of tension or conflict. There isn't an argument without a thesis, and there isn't a story without a crisis. Asking your readers to read anything before either of those two things happen is like inviting somebody over to dinner and then forcing them to watch you cook. So now we know that every piece of writing has its exigence, or the spark that gets it moving towards its purpose. And that means that we know where we need to start our writing. Now, to avoid misunderstandings, I want to be clear about a few things. Obviously, you can start too close to an ending, and that can be just as problematic as starting too far away from it. But I do think it's much less common. There's value in building to a climax or providing some background context, but it's also important to consider what the minimum amount of setup a reader needs would be. For example, I remember hearing once that in the early days of cinema, filmmakers thought they needed to show their characters getting out of a car, walking down the street, and into the courthouse if their audience was ever going to know that something was taking place at the courthouse. But they quickly learned that they could just open on a courtroom scene with a judge, jury, and bailiff, and audiences would know exactly where they were. Sometimes I think we fall into the trap of feeling like we need to explain more to our readers than we actually do. In fact, they're much more willing to accept strange and magical worlds or large societal problems than we often give them credit for. So of course don't throw them into the deep end with nothing to go on, but do consider giving them the minimum amount of setup that they would need. Second, I don't mean that you should start your real writing as close to the end as possible. If you're just starting out, you might not know what the ending is, and you need to do some exploratory writing before you even figure that out. When I say start as close to the ending as possible, I don't mean that you need to have some kind of clairvoyant sense of where your project will end up. Instead, I just mean to point out that all of that writing that you do to figure out what you're going to say doesn't need to be in the final draft. You needed it to help you think, but your reader doesn't need to sit through it. So just delete it. It's honestly the most freeing thing you could do. And finally, don't forget the rhetorical and artistic value of things like pleasure and human decency. Starting close to the end does not mean polishing your piece to its most efficient and to-the-point form. Outlines are optimally efficient, but people don't read them for fun, so let your writing live and breathe. For example, I'm always a little put off by emails that are all business and purely informational. Starting out by saying something like, "Hi, I hope you're having a nice day," is not the most efficient way to begin, but it is a valuable way to set the reader up to be more receptive to the actual purpose of the email. So, as with all things rhetorical, there's a balance to maintain, and knowing exactly what to do in any given situation will depend on the situation itself. Either way, though, it's still a good idea to make sure that you aren't starting your readers off too far from the action. Whether I've been writing poetry, instructions for students, or a dissertation, I've tried to remember my teacher's advice to start as close to the end as possible, and I think it's really improved my writing in meaningful ways. Of course, when I say writing, I really mean that this is good advice for revising. Like we've already mentioned, you're probably going to have to do a lot of writing before you know what you're going to say and where your ending actually is. But once you have gotten a draft written out, you'll be in a great position to identify the minimum amount of setup that your readers will really need, and then to eliminate anything else that would burden them beyond that. Because remember, it's all about creating a good experience for the readers, even if it means deleting something that it took you a long time to write. In the end, it's better for the writing, even if it stings the ego a little bit. And honestly, if a little bit of an ego sting is the worst thing that happens when we're writing and revising, I'd say we're in a pretty good place. So get out there and get yourself started as close to the ending as possible. And speaking of endings, we've reached ours for today. So thanks for watching, and I'll see you later.